This is the Achieving Excellence in Data Visualization Beyond the Basics with Doctors Martha Larkin and George Larkin, and George goes by Dick.
Okay, I'm Martha Larkin, and my co-presenter is Dick Larkin, and we want to welcome you from our home in sunny Florida, our backyard actually. Can everyone hear me okay? So there are several points, there are areas that we want to share with you regarding data visualization. One is that data can tell a story, and in order for it to do so, there's some techniques for planning and implementation. We base a lot of our presentation around Edward Tufte's principles that Dick will be sharing with you later. And also he'll be sharing some innovative examples of data visualization. And then finally, we will share some resources and references with you. Next, please. So to start with data telling a good story. Next, please. We're all familiar with stories. We've enjoyed stories from our childhood and even in our adulthood. And so, you know, all good stories have a beginning. So if you can see on the left-hand side, we've tried to visualize a very popular story beginning, once upon a time. So we have the word once sitting upon a clock indicating time. And so that can be a story beginning, and then you have the events in the middle, and then you have an end to the story. And for us, since we live in Florida, a good ending to the day for us is going over to the beach nearby and watching a beautiful sunset. Next, please. So there are several best practices for data storytelling. And some of these are probably reinforcing what Jim and Hillary have already talked about. They've talked a little bit about your audience and different kinds of audiences, but you want to make sure that you know what you want your audience to learn. So it might be, you might have some sort of question to help guide you in that respect. And then the second practice is end with an insight. You know, where are you going? Where do you want to end with this? In order for a story to be, a data story to be useful, you need to be able to learn something from it or convey something from it. Otherwise, the story's not worth telling. The third point is to tell a compelling story. If you think about it, sometimes the things we remember the most are some of the things that we've gained from stories. So when we show people or share people our data, we want to take them on our journey, that it's a story as we're going on this journey. The fourth practice is using both visuals and words. Even though sometimes you know, we think, oh, the picture can tell the whole story, we might want to emphasize some particular words to help us call out a particular point. So people tend to understand trends and patterns and metrics sometimes better if we do use the visuals. But if we want to emphasize something, then we can add words to help us do that. Another storytelling practice, we turn to old Abe Lincoln to be honest and credible. Because people value honesty. Sometimes the data don't always tell us exactly what we want them to, but we need to share both the positive and sometimes share the negative. We don't want to sugarcoat the negative. We need to be honest in sharing our data. The sixth point is we need to be clear and concise. So we want to focus on the things that are going to help us tell the story. The data will help us tell the story, and remove anything else that isn't applicable. The seventh practice is, once again, knowing and catering to your audience. And I think Jim and Hillary did a nice job of talking about, you know, the audience interests and goals, and whether you should you know, go more into detail or whether it's more appropriate just to have a higher level summary for your audience. And then the eighth practice is to provide context. So, you know, we might be comparing something over time, but anyway, if we have some numbers there, some data there, we have to have the context in order for our story to be meaningful. Here are a few questions to consider when presenting data. And we think, well, why should I represent my message or my data visually? And it all has to do with the brain processing visuals faster than it does words. When you use both words and images, you help your audience to engage both their short and long-term memory, and it makes your message more memorable. The second question, which ideas should I represent visually? You have some choices there. The obvious one might be the idea that's most relevant to the core message of your presentation, the point that you want to make sure your audience takes away. But you may want to also put in visual a complex idea to make sure that your audience makes sense of what it is that you're trying to convey. And then a third possibility is something that would evoke an emotional response. Sometimes emotions move us to change, and if that's the purpose of what you're trying to do with your data is to move your audience to change or do something differently, then that might be an appropriate visual for you. The third question is, what does the concept look like? And so this is where you might do some brainstorming with yourself. We all know about Zoom with regard to our cameras on our phones. And so you could use the Zoom principle to help you determine what comes to mind. Because you want to be creative, you might want to first zoom out so you can think broadly about something. Think about what it is you're trying to convey, maybe just temporarily taking the concept outside of your presentation, what it might look like. You might think of some other things to compare it to, make some analogies, and then kind of zoom into more specifics to get you thinking about what the idea might look like in action. And then the fourth one, once again, refers to how do you want the audience to feel. If you want them to really tap into their heart, into their emotions, then you can tailor your presentation that way. Okay, so we will go into our next section, which is planning and implementing data visualization. Next, please. So Fry outlined 6 planning considerations for data visualization. The first one had to do with too much information, and I'm sure we can all identify with that, information overload. So we have to consider, you know, what's important, and realizing sometimes we just can't talk about everything because we have so much. The second consideration is, you know, once we have all these technology tools and they're working properly and we can collect all this data, we sometimes get excited about collecting all the data, but we need to really pull out what is meaningful and to visualize it in order to get the maximum benefits out of the data. The third thing has to do with sophisticated thinking. So sometimes we only get at the surface level, but we really want people to think deeply about the data in order to establish meaning. So we want to make sure that we present the data in a way that it helps us to do that. The fourth planning consideration is the data are ever changing. They're dynamic, they're not static, and so we can't depend on things to remain the same. The fifth consideration has to do with our technology capabilities, and sometimes we can collect and create and store so much data that it's often easy for the data to be disassociated from the purpose for collecting it. So if we want to make sure that we're continuing to stay true to our purpose, our meaning, that we make sure the data stays with, that we keep that in mind. The sixth planning consideration is to make sure that we consult many disciplines. Data are complex, and sometimes by looking at diverse fields, it can help us to acquire meaningful solutions. Fry also included 7 stages of data visualization, and so you'll have that when you get the PowerPoint slides, but we wanted to focus on representation, so we won't go into all of those today. Next, please. And Edward Tufte is someone, he is an American statistician and professor emeritus of political science, statistics, and computer science at Yale University. And so he's very well known for his writings on information design and is a pioneer in the field of data visualization. So much of the work that follows is based on, that we've put together, is based on Tufte's work. He has several books that are available, and also there's additional information on his website, and we do have the link to his website later on. So I'll turn things over to Dick to share some information about how Tufte's principles can apply to some of your data.
Thank you, Martha. As Martha said, Tufte is, I would think, the sort of the founder of the whole notion of excellence in data visualization. He does do webinars, or seminars, not webinars, but live seminars in a variety of areas throughout the United States. So if he's ever in the Twin Cities area, I would strongly urge you to go to one of Tufte's seminars. I think it would be well worth your time and effort. Martha and I have both attended the seminars and found them to be very helpful. But I'm going to run through Tufte's principles with you and try to illustrate them for you. And the first principle that Tufte talks about is the representation of numbers as physically measured on the surface of the graph should be proportional to the number qualities you're representing. Now, I've shown 2 graphs here. The graph on the left I used some hypothetical data with the number of children attending after-school programs, and I just broke them down into 2 categories: those programs that were community-based and those programs that were sponsored by private for-profit type of entities. And the way the graph looks to the left, we start out with a little over 1 million children in the community-based programs, and over the course of the years, from 2004 to 2020, that number has decreased down to about 450,000, 467,000. Well, that's a pretty big decrease. But then on the other hand, the number of children attending private after-school programs has increased from 144,000 to about 163,000. Well, that's a fairly substantial increase too. The public programs have dropped a little over 50%, and the private programs have increased over 13%. But the way that graph represents it, it's a misrepresentation of the numbers. The public programs still have over 149,000, or no, still have over 300,000 more students than the private programs. Whereas the one on the right shows a more accurate representation, starting with 1 million people and going down to 800,000, and then starting with the number 145,000 and going down up to 163,000. You can see when you start with those original data points and so forth, that the amount of increase in the private programs is almost insignificant compared to the public programs. So as Mark Twain used to say, liars don't use, or statistics don't lie, but liars sure can use statistics. I guess we could change that into liars sure can use visuals also. Next slide, please. The next one is something that Jim talked about, and it has to do with clearly labeling your charts. The chart on the right, obviously, is a poorly labeled chart, and this is actual data from one of your youth surveys. How many people answered yes and no to a particular question, question 15. But on the right, on the left, we don't know what question 15 was. We don't know how they answered. On the right, the labeling clears everything up for us. And Jim talks about it not even using a legend, but go ahead and write the the response right on the graph, and you can do that. I also like to put the numbers of responses on the top. So I think that obviously the chart on the right would be much easier to understand. Next slide, please. Okay, the third chart, the third principle is to show variations in the data, not in chart design. Jim showed you a chart from the state of Georgia, which was actually presented as a justification for reopening the state of Georgia. They said they had a decline in COVID cases over a 14-day period. What they didn't do, however, was arrange the data in chronological order. They started the date with the highest number of cases and ended the date with the lowest number of cases instead of taking the dates in chronological order. I've done the same with my two example charts here. The chart on the left and the chart on the right represent exactly the same data. However, the chart on the right is in chronological order, and it shows that responses went up, then they curtailed. The chart on the left shows that responses continuously tend to go up. That's not true. That's a misrepresentation of data by a manipulation of the data design on the chart. And you would say, well, no one would do that, but I just, Jim gave you the example. That's exactly what they did in the state of Georgia. And they said it was a design error. One of the members of the Georgia state legislature was a little more critical of that. He said he thought no one made errors that egregious on data representation and thought it was probably done on purpose. Next slide, please. Okay, Jim also talked about the idea of showing money in what the term he couldn't think of, constant dollars. And these two charts represent the cost of a loaf of bread from 1930 to 2020 or 2010. In 1930, a loaf of bread cost less than 50 cents. By 2010, it cost about $2.50. So if you look at the chart on the left, you would think that the price of a loaf of bread had just exploded. However, if you look at the chart on the right, which is done in 1970 constant dollars, and I chose 1970 because that was the midpoint between 1930 and 2010, you see that the price of the loaf of bread has really not increased that much in relative dollars. Let me see if I can explain that a little bit to you. In 1930, the average American household was making about $1,368 a month. In 2010, the average American household was making a little less than $50,000 a month. So the relative cost of buying a loaf of bread in 2010 wasn't all that much greater than the relative cost of buying a loaf of bread in 1930. So if you're thinking about serving some peanut butter and jelly sandwiches at one of your events, the loaf of bread will not bust your budget. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, the fifth graphic principle of Tufte's is that you should show no more variation in your representation on your graph than the number of variables you're trying to represent. So in this case, I'm simply trying to represent a one-dimensional variable, and that is response to surveys over time. And this data was actually drawn from some of the information you provided me. The chart on the left increases both on the vertical and the horizontal axis, whereas the chart on the right only increases on the vertical axis. Well, we're only measuring a one-dimensional variable, so there should be absolutely no horizontal increase in the representation of that variable. If you look at the chart on the right, it will give you a far more accurate description of the increase, whereas the chart on the left may make you think that they were much larger or smaller variations in the data than there actually were. Okay. Next chart, please. And our final principle that Tufte gives us is that data should not be quoted or represented out of context. The chart on the right has surveys or the yes surveys to a youth questionnaire. The surveys on the right, same data. However, on the left chart, the data is presented out of context. You have no idea how many no surveys, how many no answers there were, how many people answered the question. So if we look closely at, let's say, 2016, 2017, we say, well, gee, there were a lot of people answering yes, but how many people answered no? Well, if you go over to the chart on the right, you see, well, there were a whole lot of people answering yes, but there still weren't very many people answering no, that you still are as successful as you originally thought you were. It simply gives you some context in which to put the data. So Tufte, like I said, he has these 6 principles of data integrity. Jim has shown you a great deal about how to do this, and I think Tufte provides a really good philosophical background for why to do it. So if you'll move on to the next slide for me, Molly. We're going to talk about some innovative ways to display data, and I've identified 3. One's out of the New York Times, one is from the Johns Hopkins University, and the third one is some work that I was involved in a few years ago that I want to share with you. So next slide, please. Okay, we hear a lot today with the COVID-19 pandemic about achieving herd immunity. And this chart out of the New York Times illustrates what it would take for various cities throughout the world to achieve herd immunity. The graph or the circle in the far left-hand top corner shows how many of the dots would have to turn red before a community would acquire herd immunity. And then the other charts of New York and London, and I think there's Madrid and a couple other cities there, show you where they are at the present time with relationship to how many of those dots they have filled. I would think that this might be a very helpful chart if you were trying to show how many youth centers or something like that you might need around the Twin City area, and put how many you currently have, and then how many the statistics would tell you would need for the youth population to serve. You could break it down by community, you could break it down by neighborhood, you could break it down in a whole variety of different ways. I thought that was a very interesting way to display that data. I kept hearing that in order to achieve herd immunity, at least 60% of the people in any given area would have to have been affected by the disease and either have developed immunity through infection or through natural means or through vaccination. But that still didn't mean a whole lot to me. But when I saw this graph to how many more dots would have to be colored in New York, I realized we're not very far along the way to developing herd immunity. Next, please.
Yeah, so just to note that we're actually at time. So I just put in a link into the chat for folks who would be willing to fill out a survey. We would be so grateful. I know that our time was cut short. I would like to thank our presenters, Dr. Dick and Martha Larkin, for their expertise lending, and we will make this information available to all attendees, both the recording of the event as well as the slides. So what I would like to do is invite anybody who would like to stay on. I'm going to keep recording and allow them to finish their presentation, so we have that as a resource. If you need to drop off for another call, then of course attend to your community needs, but I'm going to go ahead and let them continue their presentation. But in the meantime, thank you so much for joining, and apologies again for the technological challenges that we all experienced. Your patience is very much appreciated. So I'm going to send it back over to our presenters to finish up for those who can stick with us for a little while. Take care, everybody.
Thank you, Molly. I only have about 5 more minutes, so it's not much more. Okay, great. Next slide, please. A second type of innovative data visualization that's come about in the last several years is geographic information system. And this graph is from the Johns Hopkins University webpage that shows the spread of the COVID-19 virus across the United States. But Geographic information systems have become cheaper, they're easier to use, and they represent a very powerful way of displaying digital data in a geographic format. All data has some sort of geographic location to it, and so this is an outstanding way to display data if it has any type of geographic component at all. Okay, and my final slide illustrates a use of virtual reality. Several years ago, a colleague of mine and I were asked to evaluate a federal grant program. And what we were to look at was how practicing teachers might utilize technology, or future teachers might utilize technology to assist students. And so we looked at barriers to technology. We looked at the goals they wanted to achieve. We looked at barriers that would prevent them from achieving those goals and strategies that they might use to overcome those variables or barriers. And what we found was we had about 100 or so, well, we had one goal, but we had about 100 or so barriers and about 100 or so strategies that they could use. So we listed those, we linked them, we tried to display them in a way that made sense. And on the left, if we displayed those variables and those connections in a two-dimensional format, you got the graph, or you got the chart on the left. But we worked with Virginia Tech and put those variables into a three-dimensional virtual reality environment where you could put on goggles and walk from the barrier through the strategy to the goals you wanted to achieve, so that you could actually navigate what we had discovered. Now, at that time, virtual reality was a fairly expensive way to do things. Today, you can order software off the internet, put it on your microcomputer, your desktop, and produce your own virtual reality visualizations. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm going to talk very briefly about some good sources for learning more about data visualization. So go ahead, Molly, please. Go ahead for the next, do that one too. All right, SAS is a statistical package. I would not advertise the statistical package. I don't have anything to say about that one way or the other, but I would advise you to go to their website, because their website has a lot of good resources on data visualization, SAS. It's a statistical package. Next, please. Another one is another statistical package is Stata, and they also have a great deal of information on their website about doing graphics and visualizations. Next, please. Go back one. Yeah, Tableau is the program that Jim and Hillary used, and they put out white papers on data visualization. I've talked about the one here, the 5 best practices for telling great stories with data. I would advise you to look at the Tableau website also for information on how to do data visualization. And finally, next slide, the Ezra website. Ezra is the world's leading manufacturer of geographic information systems data, and they give you just a wealth of information about what can be done, how you can use it, when you should use it, and in all different fields. They do it in medicine, art, community service, just any type of field you can think of. And the example I gave you here is a few years ago, a colleague of mine and I were looking at how Hispanics were settling throughout the southeastern United States and what impact it might have on voting patterns in the future. And we wanted to find the counties in the southeastern United States where we had the heaviest Hispanic concentrations. And although our slide has cut off the eastern part of the southeastern United States, you can see that definitely the heaviest settlements of Hispanics were in the Texas border region along the Mexican border, which comes as no surprise. But then we also found, if you look up in the northwest corner of Arkansas, there was a county up there with over 50% Hispanic population. That's pretty interesting, because before we looked at this data, mapped it out and looked at it, no one would have ever thought that thing. So if you could go on to the next slide, please, Molly. This is a list of those websites I gave you, which you'll be able to just click on and visit them. And then the next slide is simply the references we used. And our final slide was our pitiful excuse of humor, I think. A good picture equals 1,000 words. So I appreciate your time and interest. I thank you for coming. I assume we will not be doing too many questions, but if you have any questions, I think Molly or someone could probably get you our email address, and we would be happy to try to respond to them. So with that, I will turn it back to Molly and say thank you for your time and interest.
Thank you so much. Does anybody have any burning questions? Otherwise, yes, with their approval, we can send their email addresses for individual questions. But if there are any burning questions that you'd like to wrap up with, we can do that now. You can feel free to unmute.